Hello, my name's Dominic Borquin and I'm a corporate tax consultancy partner at Monahans. Stephanie Hurst is joining us today. She's a corporate tax director at Monahans. So, the spring statement, Steph, where are we?
It was a bit of a non-starter, wasn't it?
I think you're right.
Although, yeah, I mean, to be honest, she had a pretty difficult challenge, I think. I think she probably had three choices, didn't she? She could either adjust her fiscal rules, probably not, being in power for the first few months, that's not going to happen. She could raise taxes, that's going to go down like an absolute lead balloon. Or she can cut spending, and I think that's kind of where she went. Although still, I think the reforms that have been announced still aren't going to be particularly popular.
No, I tend to agree with you. And I think it's interesting, the devil is in the detail, isn't it? Because there were some, despite the fact there were no new taxes officially announced, with the OBR saying she's only got a 51% chance of hitting her forecasts, I think we can expect some tax rises in the autumn. And of course, when she stood up yesterday, she wasn't aware of the tariffs that Trump was going to announce on cars, was she? And that has got to have some sort of implication for the wider economy. The OBR also slashed the growth forecast in half. That's going to have serious implications for mortgage holders, employers, and of course some investment plans. But of course, she did hint at some tax rises, didn't she, Steph?
Yeah, there were. So there was something near the end of the budget documents about ISAs. Now, it's been in the press recently, some rumours that the annual investment allowance would go down from 20,000 to 4,000. That hasn't been announced, although I think what they have said in there that they are going to look at reforming the way in which ISAs work. They haven't specifically said anything. There's no consultation documents available. My understanding, and from some of the rumours in the press, is that they want to try and make stocks and shares ISAs more attractive to investors, because they see that as planning for long-term wealth creation and growth. There was also something in there about enterprise investment schemes and share schemes for employees. Now, there was an announcement probably about a year or so ago that some of the tax advantage schemes that we've got available to small businesses and growing businesses would be extended for another few years. So that was positive back then. I think what they've said this time is they will be looking at how schemes such as the enterprise investment scheme and venture capital schemes, both of which are designed to help small businesses attract investment, they will be looking at how those schemes operate. Now, you can probably take that one of two ways. One way will be it's probably not operating in the way that it should be, and they will cut the relief or make some changes. But the budget document does say, and I've written this down actually because it's interesting, that they are committed to supporting growing businesses and scale-ups. So it remains to be seen what they're going to do with those reliefs, but I hope they will stick around, because ultimately our small businesses, our kind of growing businesses, the lifeblood of the UK, rely on these investments, and these investors, love to have that tax relief.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They do. Just interestingly, picking up on the point you made about the ISA potentially lowering the limits for cash ISAs, I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they said I thought with banking, what happens is you give your money to the bank and they pay you interest, and then the bank lends it on to other people to invest and grow their businesses. So when I thought about that in the cold light of day, I thought, well, actually, I think they're right. That's sort of banking 101, isn't it? So why is there such a move away from cash ISAs? Anyway, I guess time will tell. But they didn't stop there, did they? They also cut benefits. So universal credit, the health element's going to be cut by £50 a week for new claimants from 2026, and then frozen until 2030. And the personal independence payment assessment is going to be overhauled. Overhauled means fewer people will qualify for the personal independence payment. Those two measures alone are going to raise nearly £5 billion by 2029, 2030. But of course, the people who are affected by those changes will not be very pleased, understandably. And of course, I imagine a number of the Labour backbenchers are already causing some trouble around what they see as benefit cuts. But I think when we think about the way the benefits bill is going to grow, it's probably going to grow by £30 billion between now and the end of 2029, 2030. So 30 billion of growth minus 5 billion of savings, that's still 25 billion pounds more on benefits. So they are slowing the rate of growth whilst also not necessarily stopping the growth altogether. And then we move on to that famous old chestnut, reducing government size. Steph, over to you.
The transformation fund, I think they've billed it as, which is aimed at driving efficiencies, I think, within the government, and improving services for working people. I think the tagline has suggested, and frontline delivery. I've written it down because it's one of those things that it's all very well and good saying we're going to drive efficiencies and we're going to introduce digital technology and AI and things to help drive that. I mean, the introduction of digital and AI is brilliant. I mean, there's no getting away from that. Absolutely, that's the kind of the way we need to go. But ultimately, if we talk about HMRC and improving that aspect of the government service, there's going to need to be more than just digital and AI that is needed to improve the service that taxpayers and us as accountants and tax advisors actually receive from HMRC. So although they've said that there's a transformation fund to improve government services, I am a little sceptical as to how that's going to go.
Yes, I think if we added up the minutes that our staff have spent hanging on the telephone waiting for HMRC to pick it up, we would. Well, I mean, who knows how much? It's just painful.
It is, absolutely. You can, if you don't call them at 8 a.m. in the morning, then you probably won't have a chance unless you're willing to spend 45 minutes on hold.
Indeed, and so you add that up over millions of staff who work in accountancy firms and millions of taxpayers, and it's there's a way of improving the service, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess there was a little bit of good news. So we all know that, and Rachel Reeves did mention it once or twice yesterday, that we live in a changing world, and I think ever since Russia invaded Ukraine 2 or 3 years ago now, the world has been a much more uncertain place. The Prime Minister announced a couple of weeks ago that they would be taking money from the aid budget to boost defence from 2027 onwards. That's about 6.5 billion a year. Well, yesterday Rachel Reeves said that they would also provide another 2.2 billion to the MOD next year. I think there is an acceptance in government that fundamentally we have to be able to defend ourselves in this country, and we don't know what sort of attacks will come at us, and we don't know where from. And frankly, given the way the US government's behaving at the moment, we're not even sure who our allies are anymore, I suspect. But of course, the thing to remember is if the MOD is buying equipment, developing new weapons, the scientists and the boffins who do that, they need to be highly skilled, they'll be well paid, and of course that will improve growth, and hopefully, of course, they'll earn high salaries and wages, and there will be a tax take from those salaries and wages. So it is double bubble with defence. Yes, we need to be able to defend ourselves, but actually the sort of research and development in technology and weapons and equipment that has to go on will certainly promote growth. Whether 2.2 billion next year and 6.4 billion the year after is enough to really activate growth remains to be seen, but I suppose time will tell. A bit more positivity in the planning reforms as well. I mean, we all know in this country that getting anything through the planning legislation is tricky, but I think you've got some details about that, Steph, haven't you, as well?
Yeah, so there's going to be quite a big reform in the planning sector. It's interesting because I was recently at a networking event in my local office, which is based in Swindon, and it was around property. And there were two things that were discussed at that event, which are kind of pertinent to the Spring Statement yesterday. So the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, my understanding from the local community and kind of property developers and people within property is that the planning system is well overdue for a reform. So I think they'll probably welcome those changes. But the other thing that we discussed at that event was the lack of people in the construction industry. So it's all very well reforming planning applications and fast tracking things, but actually who are you going to get to build those properties? I think the OBR said that the reforms will bring house building to its greatest level in the last 40 years, but actually we don't have anybody to build those houses. And that was one of the biggest things that we were discussing locally, is that, young people of today aren't necessarily going into that kind of industry. But there was something in the spring statement. I think the government pledged 625 million to boosting education in that sector. I guess probably to make it a little bit more sexy, potentially. But that's committed over the next 4 years. And interestingly, Swindon was name dropped in the spring statement, which I have never seen before. I'm quite proud of, really. But that's because I think some of that money goes towards a kind of local development fund, and particularly in our local area, where we've been kind of crying out for more investment in construction.
Yes, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I'm just thinking, sexy plumbing. You heard it here first.
If we need to give up tax, we know what to do.
Well, indeed, absolutely. I can see it now. Let's move on to the employers' national insurance hike, shall we? I think we were all anyone who runs a business was praying for some sort of rowing back of the employers' national insurance hike that is due to be go ahead next week. Unfortunately, that was not the case. There was no blinking in the headlights from the Chancellor there. It's quite clearly going to be an impact on business viability and the number of people who are employed. And the Chancellor did say towards the end of her statement, well, the average employee will be £500 a year better off after these changes that she's announcing. But of course, the question I have that probably goes a bit deeper than that is, well, how many of them will still have jobs? Because fundamentally, what we're hearing from large employers is there's going to be a significant impact on their wage bill, and therefore they will be looking at hiring processes, and potentially they may well be looking at redundancies as well. But obviously she didn't stop there, did she? She moved into the digital arena as well, Steph.
Yeah, she did. So Making Tax Digital is due to come in April 26 for sole traders and landlords with income over 50,000. That will be extended to those with income over 30,000 in April 27. And in the spring statement, Ms. Reeves mentioned that will be extended again to those with income over 20,000 from April 2028. There is also something in the spring statement which says the government will look at what they may do with those who earn less than 20,000. So we may well see some more reforms coming. I think my advice really to anyone is, Making Tax Digital is coming. It kind of is what it is. I know it's been delayed a couple of times, but it seems to me that the trajectory is it's coming. It's here to stay. We've just got to get used to it. So I think really my advice to anyone who's a sole trader or a landlord who isn't on a accountancy software, we still have clients who come in with bags of receipts at the end of every tax year. Everybody does. But that won't be able to happen going forward for sole traders. They need to be on some kind of software. So if you know you're going to be affected by Making Tax Digital in the next few years, why wait? Get yourself onto an accounting software now. Get used to it. Use this time to actually get yourself into a system that you can get used to, that you like. And by the time Making Tax Digital comes, it won't be as much of a headache as perhaps it might be if you leave it to the last minute.
Absolutely. I think the other thing is, of course, as well, is that they talk about when people first go into Making Tax Digital, there'll be a light touch penalty regime. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really one to be wanting to test the light touch penalty regime, but I'm sure some people will, and then they'll find exactly how light touch they are. So because of course cracking down on tax defaulters is another government target, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So I think, is it 6.5 billion? The headline was on cracking down on tax defaulters, but hasn't every chancellor said something similar? I think it was the oldest one I could find earlier was a paper from the coalition government in 2010, where they were talking about tax defaulters and cracking down on tax avoidance. So it's been a consistent thing year on year. So again, they will put measures in place to avoid tax fraud, tax evasion, tax avoidance, and things like that. whether or not it will raise the 6.5 billion that the government's hoping for, I'm a little bit skeptical about that one, I think.
Yeah, I don't want to misquote the OBR, but I think they were as well, because I think somebody said if they raise £6.5 billion, that'd be the most anyone's raised cracking down on tax defaulters. So time will tell, but yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll see.
I think she did mention in the spring statement that I think they were recruiting 600 additional either debt or compliance staff and another 500 in one of those spaces. So they are boosting efforts on the HMRC side in terms of getting people in. I mean, my concern, I think, for the taxpayer is if they're increasing their ability to review tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax fraud, our compliant taxpayers potentially going to see a rise in HMRC checks or a HMRC inquiry asking about their self-assessment return. I would hope that their efforts would be focused on those serial defaulters, you know, those who are clearly committing tax fraud, tax evasion. I'd also hope, actually, just going back to the defence point that you were talking about earlier, and you mentioned about the research and development space in that area. One of the biggest HMRC challenges we've got as accountants, as tax advisors, is within the R&D space. So R&D is the most difficult to get that it's ever been. You know, you submit an R&D claim and you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get an inquiry about it. I would hope that if they're intending on boosting, you know, defence and AI and the digital space, then R&D will play a huge part of that. And I would hope that the 600, the 500, however many employees they recruit, actually they also boost it on that side as well to make sure that our R&D system is the best that it can be to allow taxpayers to have a bit more confidence in it.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's been, as you say, very, very tricky to get those sort of claims over the line.
It's been a challenge.
I did find myself slightly disappointed that, as I'm sure the Chancellor did say that they were going to increase the number of prosecutions for tax evasion by 20% over the life of the Parliament. And I thought, well, if you've got that many people evading tax, and when evasion is illegal, so we're not talking about avoidance, we're talking about evasion, people breaking the law to not pay their tax. I thought a 20% increase in prosecutions was a bit of a something. Well, yes, but why only 20%? If you've got a list of people who haven't paid their tax, shouldn't you be prosecuting 50% of them or 60 or I don't know? We'll see. I suppose the question now is, was there any good news, Steph? Was there anything we can say, well, this is coming and it might be good news?
Well, I suppose the good news is that they haven't raised any more taxes.
That is very true. That is very true. Not yet. You've got 6 months. Yeah.
Yeah, give it time.
Yeah.
I think that there was potentially some good news on the business rates front. I think they announced that there would be a business rates pathway. I can't remember if there was any particular timescale put on that, but I think they've been talking about it since 2010, haven't they, Dominic?
They have, yes. I remember George Osborne standing up in 2010 when, frankly, we were all in short trousers at that point, and saying, oh, yes, of course, we'll be reforming business rates. And ever since then, it seems to have been kicked into the long grass by successive chancellors. So let's hope a pathway to reform is announced. I think it's due to be announced in the autumn. So let's hope we get something, because that is it seems to be a massive burden to those in particularly in the retail and hospitality space who frankly can least afford it, particularly now with all the other tax rises that they're going to be facing.
I do hope because they did apply some discounts to certain sectors, didn't they, for a while, and I hope that any reforms that they do put in place will take that into consideration and actually will look at the sectors that need the assistance the most.
Well, absolutely. There's always a move, isn't there, to try and reinvigorate the high street, and of course the last thing you need to do is make it more difficult for business to set up and run there, and make it more expensive for them to do so. So any sort of pathway to reform and lowering the business rates burden would be welcome, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think there are any more thoughts we've got at the moment, are there, Steph? I think we've covered most of the ground.
Well, I've got a question. What do you think is going to happen in the autumn?
Well, picture the scene. She's just cut some benefits, cut the rate of increase in benefits, put it that way, and that's not going to go down very well. If I was a betting man, I would say that there are going to be tax rises in the autumn because, as I say, when she sat down yesterday after delivering the spring statement, Donald Trump had not announced the 25% tariffs on cars, for example. £6.5 billion worth of cars goes from this country to the US, largest export market for cars from the UK, and suddenly those cars are going to be £1.5 billion more expensive. That's got to affect growth. It's got to affect how many of those cars are actually going to be sold in the US, and that's the sort of uncertainty that we face. So I think it won't take much to blow the Chancellor's forecasts off course, and therefore I would expect some tax rises. I don't know about you. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you, actually. I think I don't think she could have raised any taxes in this spring statement. I think it would have been a very, very bad idea. So I think anything that will be changed will be left to the autumn. I do wonder whether they will continue to look at inheritance tax, maybe extending the potentially exempt transfer years from 7 to 10, maybe you have to survive 10 years instead of 7. Potentially freezing the personal allowance and the basic rate bands of tax again.
Well, that's an easy. Oh, we're not raising taxes, are we?
Exactly.
We're not raising income tax. We're just freezing the thresholds again. So yes, I could see that being a target, and of course capital gains tax, because I guess they would say, well, you know what, if you make a capital gain, why shouldn't you pay a rate that's nearer the income tax rate on those gains? I guess you don't, because it's a reward for speculating and accumulating, perhaps. But I'm not sure the Labour government sees it that way. So I think I'd agree. I think capital gains tax is ripe for increase as well.
Yeah, I would have a bit of a concern about business asset disposal relief, although if they're true to their word and say that, you know, they're interested in growth and small startup businesses, then actually you probably want to keep that around.
Yes. So this is the relief, isn't it? That was at 10% for the first £1 million if you dispose of a business, soon to be 14% from the 6th of April, so that's the end of next week, and then from the 6th of April 2026 it's going to be 18%, isn't it? So they've already had a crack at that, but of course they could get rid of it entirely. They may well do that.
Yeah, they may well do that. Whether or not they'll change anything further with national insurance, I'd hope not, because although it's the headline, isn't it? It's what they say. It's when we won't raise taxes. Well, okay, that may well be true, that you've not raised taxes in the traditional sense. But when you think about the average employee, as you were saying earlier, you know, the national insurance rise affects everybody. You know, we could be earning less overall because we're not going to get a pay rise. Our wages won't keep up with inflation because of that. So actually, you kind of are taxing us, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
So I would hope that she wouldn't do anything further in that space.
No, I'd agree. But I think we are very much in a holding pattern, though, aren't we? So really, I think if you are concerned about the tax rises, if you're concerned about some of the announcements in the spring statement yesterday, by all means get in touch with Steph or I, or contact your usual Monahans team member, and we'll be happy to try and steer you through the bear traps, the ones we know about, that is, at the moment anyway.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for listening.